Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for our conversation about telling about women veterans' stories. I'll give it like a couple more seconds before we dive into today's conversation with the amazing Dr. Qwynn Galloway-Salazar in a moment. And I know that we also have some folks that are live streaming with us via Facebook as well. So just want to give some space for that as folks get settled. All right. I think we're good to get started. So let's go ahead and get some started. Again, hi, everyone. I'm Linnea Hiesel. I'm the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at Warrior Scholar Project. And this program is brought to you by our WVEDS program, which is Women Veterans Empowerment Dialogues, which is really an opportunity to highlight and connect women veterans to not only other women veterans, but also resources, shared experiences. And it's not unique to only women veterans having access to this information. I think no matter your gender, this is also important for how do we uplift and support women veterans, because for so long they often weren't talked about as a part of the military community. So really want to thank you all for joining us today for our conversation with Dr. Qwynn Galloway-Salazar, and I only get to call her doctor. That's it, like no more times. Yep, that's it. So Qwynn made it very clear that she doesn't want to have that title doctor thrown at us every 5 seconds. So that way she, keeping it real. She's one of us, even though only, less than 1%, I feel like the US population has a doctorate, as I'm on that journey and hope to get that soon as well. So before we get started, I just want to do a land acknowledgement, which is an opportunity to engage all present in an ongoing Indigenous awareness to enact meaningful and reciprocal relationships with ancestors and contemporary tribal nations. We have the opportunity to partake in a shared responsibility to include and support Indigenous communities and sovereign tribes. I am calling in today from Springfield, Virginia, formerly known or formerly inhabited by the Doeg ancestors, where I give greetings and gratitude for this land. And if you'd like to learn more about the Native American and Indigenous tribal and nation history, you can learn more by going to the Native Land Digital, and then we'll provide a link in the chat for you to have access to that. So again, we are here with Qwynn Galloway-Salazar, a U.S. Army veteran, a military spouse, founder of In Their Honor, LLC, and an end-of-life doula practitioner and educator. And to top it off, like, she doesn't have enough to do. She's also the co-principal investigator with Dr. Philip Napoli for the Brooklyn College Veterans History Project. And we'll get into a little bit more about each of the amazing things that I just, didn't even do justice of all the great things Qwynn is doing. But really, I wanted to invite Qwynn today for this WVEDS because March is the month to celebrate Women's History Month. And as we're nearing the end of the month, today's conversation is to encompass the power and impact of telling the stories of women veterans. As I mentioned earlier, for a long time, talking about the women veteran experience often wasn't included when we were talking about the military community. Let alone, it wasn't until 1981 where Congress passed legislation to recognize 1 week, that's it, just 1 week, in March as Women Veterans Week. Subsequent years, the week-long recognition evolved to presidential proclamations that became a month-long recognition to celebrate and honor the achievements of breaking of glass ceilings, and just as important, identifying the lived experiences of women throughout our history. But as we've, discussed, women have significant roles in serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. And for centuries, we learned about these women through documents, artifacts, and of course, storytelling. And so in this 21st century, we all have a role in capturing and sharing these stories of today's service members and veterans. And I'm hoping, we get really the best way with Qwynn's conversation today of what it means to learn how to do this storytelling. So I'm going to stop talking because again, you're going to learn more from Qwynn. But Qwynn, tell us a little bit about your story. What is the legacy story you want us to remember you or remember about you?
Yeah. So here's what's interesting, right? I am a firm believer that for each of us who make the decision to raise our right hand, there is this unique dopeism that's ingrained in us to want to serve. And my story of service started like high school. I'm almost 6 foot tall. And, teachers and coaches in high school wanted me to play ball. I had no interest in playing sports at all. I don't know what to do with a ball. What I did have a unique interest in was volunteering for our school's clown club, where I had the opportunity to go to nursing homes, dress up as a clown, spend time with and connect with aging people and hear their stories. Never realized that that was kind of the thread that would go through my life. And my freshman year in college, like so many of us, on a college campus, we have a slew of recruiters out there that sell us all of these amazing dreams about seeing the world. And so, like many that came before me, I raised my right hand to continue serving and serve the United States Army. I was 18 at the time, and I'm dating myself, I'm aging myself when I say Gulf War occurred when I was in the 3rd grade. So in my mind, surely I felt I can do this term of service, get out of the military, let them show me the world, pay for my college tuition without seeing another war. That was 2001, spring of 2001. I am a New Yorker. Shortly after coming home from basic training, 9/11 happened. And it changed the entire trajectory of my life. So in short, I have been serving service members, veterans, and their families since 2001. When I took my uniform off, I will be honest, I said, I am done. Don't tell me anything else about the military, but here I still am, because once again, there's this level of dopeness that's ingrained in all of us that shows up in a way that we want to serve and to continue to serve. So I've done a myriad of things, and that's a whole conversation in its own. But for the purpose of today, my legacy, to answer your question, would be one in which I inspire women, veterans, to show up, tell their stories. Don't hesitate to say, I served too, right? I served. I have a story to tell, and my story matters.
That's powerful. That's powerful. And yes, your story does matter, because everyone's story matters. And so how do we, sometimes it's talking ourselves into recognizing that our story matters. And while granted, I didn't serve in the military, I identify as a military spouse, but as we think about that we're all worthy of, feeling like that you matter. I think that is sometimes we have to get out of our own head to be able to say, oh, I should tell my story to others. And that's a value. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Absolutely.
And so when I was doing my homework on your background, I came across another podcast where you had shared the stories that you were privy to working in a mailroom. And I immediately thought, and of course, this year, there's been a lot of movement and momentum around the 6888, and which was an all-women Black Army unit in World War II, tasked with sorting plain hangers, like not just a room, like literally plain hangers full of mail. And recognizing that symbolic, even cultural aspect of communication, mail, and what that means in terms of getting something in the mail while serving with someone in the military. But I want you to share your story with your experience working in a base mailroom where the roles and or the role of how those stories imprinted your life and your journey.
Yeah, yeah. So I got called up in 2003, to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. My military occupational specialty was finance. However, I picked up another training identifier while I was at Bragg, which was postal. So here I am. My mailroom was literally in the middle of where special forces trained, right? So I'm having the opportunity to see all of these things happen before me in the midst of when the war was really hot and heavy. And we had so many units that were leaving out of Fort Bragg, training up and then gearing out to deploy to Fort Bragg. And we also had units coming back. And I was the lone person in the mailroom. And the stories of service members, of soldiers that would come in from enlisted to officer, I would hear stories of, my wife is having a baby, and I don't know if I'm going to be alive to see my baby. I would hear stories of mothers saying they had to leave their children behind, of course, to serve. So and what I didn't know at the time, I was 21, right? To be really honest, like, I was doing my job. I really wasn't even thinking about the impacts of my service and how it affected my own family at the time. But I kept on showing up and holding this space for soldiers that really were vulnerable and transparent about what was going on in our world, and sitting with officers who had to show this brave face in front of their troops, but sitting down beside them, getting to know them and saying, hey, sir, hey, ma'am, if you want to show up this time every day, for as long as you're here, I'll sit here and I'll hold this space. I didn't realize at that time, because I was so young, that that was a gift of being able to do that. But what I realized years later is that mailroom was a safe space for so many people to come in, dump their stuff, get a sense of renewal, and go back out to the mission. And I'm grateful for that experience, because if there's any experience that I had in the military that prepared me for my journey, it was that one, where I had the opportunity to talk about life and death and what it meant to leave a legacy behind of greatness and service.
It's really powerful. And it reminds me a little bit, during my time at Georgetown, we had a professor, Dr. Barbara Mujica, who had this idea of women who write about war or just military service, and the uniqueness that you don't necessarily have to be on the front lines to understand the impacts of what war may have, and being able to tell it from the lens point of in a mailroom, or being a refugee, or being a parent of somebody who serves. There are different connections in terms of what that storytelling can manifest. And so when I say it's like on all of us, it's because we all have some capacity or connection to it in some way or other. So that was really powerful to be able to recognize how what seems like a mediocre, just good old mailroom really had significance in people's lives, and especially in that context.
And in my life too, right? So hearing those stories, and I want to make sure that I frame all this stuff in the context of scholar. I was also a student, right? I was called up on active duty. I was a junior in college. And so I was working at that time to finish my degree. And my bachelor's degree was in criminal justice. But hearing all of those stories and those experiences, and then seeing some of the soldiers that were coming home, it caused me to say, I'm going to get a master's degree in counseling, because I want to be there and to support those that served, that are coming home with challenges and those invisible wounds, and later on, the visible wounds that we so often hear about, but not always know what to do to support.
Wow. So if I'm hearing you correctly, your service and this assignment that, the military told you had to go on was a catalyst for you to understand where you could make an impact, and you could identify, okay, these are the educational goals that I need to set for myself in order for me to make that impact. And you wouldn't have gotten that exposure had you not been serving in the military.
No.
I'm going to take a leap of faith on that. Wow.
I wanted to be an FBI agent. So I joined the military because I wanted some credits, and I was a criminal justice major, and I was going to go into law enforcement and then join the FBI. That was my trajectory that I was going in. There was a different path, and I'm thankful every day for that path.
Going off script here.
Do it.
Yeah. So like, how did you process a little bit? Was it like through reflection? Like, how did you know, like, I know I had this one goal of being an FBI agent, but what was it that you felt or thought or saw to be like, you know what, I need to make a pivot a little bit in terms of what my new goal is going to be? Do you have a sense in terms of what that looked like?
Yeah. So once again, that thread that was always service, but the piece that I picked up in the military and in the mailroom was I loved collecting stories. So oftentimes you'll hear me either call myself an oral historian or a story collector. I loved hearing stories to the point where I can hear a story and relate it back in a context where whatever the topic was, I could use the story to teach a lesson. And that allowed me to say, okay, as much as I would love to delve into the world of criminal justice and do some amazing work, I feel like with where we are as a nation, with veterans at that time coming home with post-traumatic stress and traumatic brain injuries and suicidal ideations and suicide, I felt that my calling was stronger in the lens and in the space of counseling than what it was pursuing the FBI.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And so thinking about your educational journey, I'm curious, especially as in my decades of experience, we often think about like MOS translators and, hearing that if you served in X roles, whether that's finance or mail, then that's what you should be doing in the outside world. But as you've just articulated, there are different pathways in terms of how you can utilize what you did in the military in beyond service. And so, you now also do a lot of work with end of life doula and, telling the stories of others. How did education play a role in your life to be able to make that transition?
Yeah. So my bachelor's degree is in criminal justice. My master's degree is in counseling, and I have a PhD in industrial and organizational psychology. And when you think of all three of those, you're like, what the heck was she thinking about? And how do they all go together? So when I came home off of active duty, thinking about that transition, and to everyone who's in the audience, I think you're going to feel me when I say transition from the military isn't always easy. You can sit in TAPS, get all the brochures, get all the benefit information, get everything that you think that you need, but really you're just wanting to get the heck out of there, get back into this said civilian world to resume your place in life. And so that's what I thought that I was doing. And I will never forget my very first job interview, which was in finance. I show up and I'm thinking, yeah, they're going to hire me. Like, I just got off of active duty. My MOS was finance. And they're looking at me on this panel interview, and I'm looking at them. And we're like, what do we even do with one another? Because your skill set does not translate here. And your soft skills and hard skills don't meet the culture of this organization. And I'm sitting there stoic as hell, because I just left Fort Bragg and I'm just like, what is this, right? Like, I couldn't understand the dynamics of the civilian workforce's culture, nor could they understand the dynamics of the culture that I was coming from, on top of the fact of me just serving in the military. I was a Black woman with a very strong personality. I walked out of that interview feeling defeated. I got to my car though, and I said, self, at some point, you are going to come back to that and you're going to impact that in some way. It took me many, many years to go back to it. But when I decided to get my PhD, I wanted to focus on women veterans, transitions from the military into the civilian workforce. Because my thing was, for women that are going to come after me and women that have served in the future, I want them to have a playing field in the workforce where they can show up, bring their level of expertise, their leadership, and be respected for what they did in the military and for the characteristics and skill sets that they're going to bring that is going to catapult them in the civilian workforce. So I did that. I wrote my dissertation on post 9/11 women veterans transitions from the military into the civilian workforce. Shortly after I defended my dissertation, I got a call from the VA saying, hey, we're doing this congressional mandated report. Would you like to serve as a qualitative researcher? And I'm like, oh, heck yeah, right? Like, without a doubt. They had read my dissertation, and I'm like, who reads a dissertation? Well, someone on that team decided to read my dissertation. And what I will say is, I'm grateful for having the experience of sitting at a table with the civilian workforce organization that did not understand my culture, did not understand where I was coming from, so that I can make an impact for my sisters way down the line. And so that's how I got to IO. And even though my work now is in the end of life space, I volunteer my time with Minority Veterans of America and serving in the capacity of looking at emerging leaders, veterans that are transitioning from the military into the civilian workforce. And how can we show up and support? How can we be coaches, peer mentors, just people that are ride or die to say, you know what? I get it. Taking that uniform off is not easy. Tell me your story. I'm going to tell you mine, and let's navigate this space together.
That's amazing. And there's so many things to pick from that last response you had there, Qwynn, in terms of not only is storytelling an essential part of maybe identifying or, coming to recognize who you are as a person, but how powerful it can be in terms of educating those who may not be familiar with the cultures that we come from, whether that is the military culture and engaging with civilian cultures, or being a woman veteran and being able to translate what is that experience like when people think it's only a man dominated military. But then also you really talked about the intersections of that, so race and gender and how that connects with your military experience, which has propelled you to volunteer a lot with Minority Veterans of America, recognizing that we won't come to these processes of shared understanding if we don't tell the stories to begin with, and we don't highlight and be able to connect with them to understand that experience is a lived experience too. It might be different than mine, or there might be some shared experiences where we can, have a moment of, shared experience in that regard. But if we're expecting the civilian culture, especially those in finance, or those that may not have a true understanding of the military connection experience, if we don't tell the stories, then we're not going to be able to shift that cultural experience, if I'm hearing you correctly.
Oh, absolutely. And thinking about my dissertation, I will never forget, my committee was like, you know, it's going to take you a really long time because I did a qualitative study. It's going to take you longer to do this qualitative study. And my point to them was, for so long, women veterans have felt invisible.
Mm.
I'm going to tell the stories of 8 women veterans for however long it takes me. I'm going to do that because their stories needed to be shared. Their stories were also a way to give them some closure as to some of the things that they experienced in service. So that's no knock on anyone who does any different methodology than qualitative, no knock. But for me, being able to collect the story, honor the story, and give the story another life, that's important.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And you give me hope that somebody will read my dissertation when I'm done with it. But to your point, I mean, the reason why there are different methods to collecting information and collecting data, I'm a qualitative researcher too. I'm not trying to fight with any of my quant friends or mixed methods, but you know, we are able to elicit the stories that explain the raw numbers.
There you go.
We're able to make those connections, and that's where the storytelling is important, to give meaning to that. And that's why I like to be friends with my mixed method and quant folks, so that way we can team up together.
There you go.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You said a word, right? And I talk about this word a lot, hope, right? You talk about hope. I use the word hope as an acronym for hearing other people's experiences. We have hope when we're able to hear another woman share their story and feel empowered and not so alone because someone else decided to do something that impacted their trajectory, right? That created such a ripple effect that changed the landscape, the paradigm, shifted everything in the way that women veterans are seen. You know, so often I tell people in an audience, close your eyes and think of a veteran. Who do you see? It's not me. It's not a woman veteran oftentimes. So it's really about being able to show up wherever you are, tell your story so we're able to have other visions of what veterans look like, right? And it's not just women. It's the diverse minority population as a whole, and showing up and telling their stories, because that's where change happens.
Yeah, for sure. We call it the sociological imagination, what could be versus what is. And so some scientific researchers really push back on that, you know, from an objective standpoint, but I'll spare the scientific ethics of that. But I'll be honest, and you know, for everybody who's here today, I was floored that Qwynn and I had never crossed paths before. I reached out, or actually Lil reached out to connect us to do this WVEDS. And in our first meeting, she had me crying, which, to be honest, is not a hard thing to do. But she had me crying, sharing her beautiful stories of Dr. Kate Hendricks Thomas. And so I had the opportunity to meet Dr. Kate when I went through the Stantu Bush Institute Veterans Leadership Program, and she was still traveling at the time with her service-connected cancer from the burn pits to teach our cohort about why it was important to do research and tell the stories about women veterans. And so I'd be curious, and you were talking about having support within your dissertation as you were going through your dissertation, and the feedback of why the work you were doing was so important. Can you share with us the call to action that Dr. Kate gave you while you were going through your dissertation? Because it's really powerful.
It's, you know, so one, I'm wearing my red lip today because when Kate and I would get on our calls once a month, the very first call we had, I had on red lipstick. And I remember Kate saying, you can rock the heck out of a red lip. I don't often do a red lip anymore, but I did it because whenever I have the opportunity to talk about Kate, it's honoring her legacy, right? During my dissertation process, Kate was there. Kate would champion me on those moments when I wanted to quit. And Kate would say, it is so important, Qwynn, for you to tell our stories. Promise me you will tell our stories. And this was towards the end of Kate's life. And at that point, that felt like a heavy call to action, right? But as I leaned into it about a year ago, we lost Kate last April, so it's been almost a year. As I leaned into it, it's allowed me to touch this point in so many areas that I never thought that I would, to include potentially co-authoring a book next year on women veterans. Kate graced this earth and gave so much richness and purpose in reducing the levels of invisibility for women veterans. Kate advocated strongly for us to be able to tell our stories and to show up unapologetically as us. And so I find it a complete honor to still have that little piece of Kate still living in terms of showing up and ensuring that every woman veteran that I have the opportunity to touch, I'm asking them to share their stories. And as we're sharing their stories, and one of the things that I started, well, Kate named, is the Legacy Collection, right? I don't even think Kate did it intentionally, but Kate named the Legacy Collection. And the Legacy Collection is a place where I collect stories of women veterans that have serious illnesses. So I have the opportunity right now to be supporting a woman veteran that has a serious illness, a life-threatening illness. And we do things throughout the week where we're collecting parts of her story, because the goal is to use her story to ensure that her legacy lives on. But also within the space of what Kate left me was Kate saying to me as I was making the decisions to become a doula, I'm like, Kate, I have been working in this space of behavioral health for all of these years. And why is the universe saying that I need to navigate this way? I'm like, this is my whole life, right? I'm always going like this. And I will never forget Kate saying to me, Qwynn, all those who wander aren't lost. And the last 20 years of your life that you've given to serve our military and veteran community has prepared you for this moment. And every minute that I may feel like I'm not the one or I'm not good enough to do this leg of the work, I'm reminded of Kate's words. There's not a day that I don't think of Kate. And it's amazing that some people can walk into your life. Some people can be placed in your life for a short period of time, but it can impact your life for the rest of your life. And for me, that was Kate.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing not only your story, but also Kate's story. She had a profound impact on me and was a really helpful reminder too. And even hearing your responses, especially whether you are an undergraduate student or a graduate student or a PhD student, or even just doing research to wanting to learn more about other experiences and cultures, to remember that who are you doing this for? Yeah. And in a lot of ways, really centering that, you know, we talk about getting an education, and yes, it's for ourselves and our own economic mobility and so forth. Don't get me wrong, it's really important. I study that, you know, full on. But at the same time, if we are doing research or we're doing projects to really understand others' experiences, we really have to connect with, well, we're also doing it for them, not just ourselves. And being able to channel that and center that, kind of getting out of the way of any selfishness, I think is a really good opportunity to kind of recenter that sometimes we're doing this scholarship work beyond ourselves. And I think that can be really powerful as well.
Yeah, and then
So,
also thinking about it on the lens of doing it with them, right?
yeah,
Like I'm doing, research on women veterans, right? Like I'm doing it with them.
that's right.
Together, we can move mountains and change how things are done and how we're seen and how policies are created and implemented. And that to me is just like when we can work together,
That's
right?
right.
We can work together and we can come together having different experiences, different levels of education, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different races, just the whole gambit, just the things that we can do to make change.
Yeah, that's really important too. We say, how do we do collaborative research with, not for our communities? And so that's really powerful and a good reminder. Thank you for sharing that. And so as we talk about all of these great, including yourself, great folks that are doing this work and uplifting and telling stories, what advice or how would you explain the process of writing or telling one's own story? What does that process look like?
Well, I think it can take so many different shapes, right? So like I'm a creative, like I'm super creative on the side. And so I draw a lot and I paint a lot. And doing those things, and I journal. So if I can say what's an easy method, is journal. Start journaling, right? Go back to when you started thinking about the military. And you don't have to remember everything verbatim. Go back to those days. Maybe write a paragraph, right? Okay, I enlisted in, Fort Polk, Louisiana. And think about some of the things that stood out to you. Think about some of the things that you experienced while you were there. Who were some of your friends? What was PT like for you? What was the chow hall like for you? Right? Like what were the feelings that you had when you raised your right hand? And start chronicling some of that. Now, of course, you're not going to remember every bit of your military experience, whether you had one term or several, or you retired. But think about some of the ones that stand out and write about them. If you have pictures, copy those pictures and write the story behind those pictures. Where were you, right? Like what was happening when you were getting ready to take that picture? What happened after that picture? So, I think we often think, okay, for example, I served 20 years and I've been all around the world. How do I even start writing my story, right? Like if you can capture every bit of your 20 years, you are absolutely extraordinary. But get something down on paper. But when you get something down on paper, make sure that someone knows that it's down on paper, right? You may go back to one of your old battle buddies and say, hey, I know the Library of Congress has a Veterans History Project. Can you interview me? I'll interview you. Right? Let's get some of our old pictures. Let's send it in. Therefore, we'll know that once we collect our stories and we send it forth, our stories are preserved throughout time. My great grand whatevers can go to the Library of Congress and learn about who I was. Excuse my language, can learn about how badass, right, I was, or learn that you were the first whatever. You served during whatever era, but start writing. There's an amazing book by a good friend of mine. No, it's just an amazing book. So I just want to share it, right? Like I absolutely adore Tracy Crow. Tracy is a Marine. They say once a Marine, always a Marine. And it's called On Point. It's a guide to writing the military story. This book is absolutely phenomenal in allowing you the space to get your story on paper. Record it. You can record it. You don't want to write it down, record it. You don't want to record it, draw pictures of it. Just get some of it down, because throughout time, we're going to want to know, who were you and what did you do? I had the privilege about 2 years ago. For 9/11, I'll normally volunteer and go help clean headstones at our national cemeteries here in Georgia. And I was cleaning a headstone, and it was a woman veteran. And I'll never forget, it said she was the first woman Vietnam paratrooper. And I shined and cleaned that thing up with so much pride. I took a picture of it because the researcher in me wanted to know more, right? And I couldn't find her story. Found her obituary, but I couldn't find her story. That made me sad, because to be able to say that you were the first, your story should be there. And period, your story should be there, right? We know that the Library of Congress, and I'm so honored to be able to partner with the Library of Congress, we know that their collections of women veterans are a little bit under 10%. So we've got to do a better job in saying our stories matter. Let's get those numbers up to ensure that our stories are in there, our experiences are in there. So the future of our nation knows that we did some amazing things as well. And quite honestly, I say amazing, there are some challenges and some really tough things that we do in service. And that's also a part of your story. And sometimes when you put that down on paper or you record it, it's such a help in closing that chapter. Some of us live with levels of regret. Some of us live with unfinished business, guilt, grief, shame, the need to forgive. But what I find in veterans that I have the opportunity to capture their life stories, their life reviews, their legacies, being able to tell that story and say, okay, I think I need to ask such and such for forgiveness. It's time. It's so cathartic. It's such a healing process. And so it's not always just about putting, your story to pen and paper. It's also about, sometimes we need to close a chapter in our life that we just haven't had the opportunity or just haven't had the right person to come alongside of us to do so.
That's really powerful. Thank you, Qwynn. And, I know you talked a little bit about ways to get these stories out there. You had mentioned the Library of Congress with the Veterans History Project. Are there other ways that we can, and when I say we, I mean folks within the Warrior Scholar Project community, because there are many women veterans within our community, but how are some ways that we can get those stories out there?
Yeah, so the Women's Memorial is another one, right? I think you all have the link where you can drop it in the chat, make her history, right? Like, that's an awesome opportunity. No plug on for them either. If you ever get the opportunity to go to Arlington, to sit in that space, I don't even have the words to put context to that. All I can say is, if you ever have the opportunity to go to Arlington, please visit the Women's Memorial. Share your story there. In communities throughout the country, in cities, there are historical societies. You can tell your story there. If you're in academia and you're on a college campus, brick and mortar or online, most universities and colleges have a history department. Share your story there. I can promise, oftentimes they are looking for, throughout the year to raise awareness about veterans. They're looking for people that'll share their stories. Share it. Doesn't have to be anything 4 hours and elaborate. Share it.
That's powerful. Thank you so much. And so I want to make sure I give ample time to folks who are here with us today to ask any questions. So feel free to ask questions by putting it in the chat. Or if you would prefer to put it in the Q&A feature where only the panelist folks can see the question, we can do that as well.
Yeah. So while people are thinking about questions, I'm gonna throw something out there. So last March, it was just pivotal. It was several nonprofit VSOs that partnered together to say, hey, let's have a virtual roundtable. I called it a virtual kitchen table, where we have veterans from different eras tell their stories. And a good friend of mine, Joan Fury, she was a Vietnam nurse, and she was the first director of the Center for Women Veterans at the VA. She was our lovely person from Vietnam that shared her story. And a few days prior to the event, Joan called me and she said, Qwynn, I got a question for you. What you got? Can I invite my other Vietnam sisters to come on? Lene, I choked up. And I choked up because if we think about history, when Vietnam veterans came home, they were not welcomed home. But so often we hear about the men that weren't welcomed home. We don't hear about the women's stories and how they weren't welcomed home and some of the challenges they experienced when they came home. And so to have this event and have women veterans from Vietnam show up in support of their Vietnam sister was absolutely amazing. But to also hear women veterans from Vietnam to OIF, OEF, OND share their stories, but then also see where some things are still the same and we still need to work on, but to also hear about some of the progress that has been made. That kitchen table was so powerful. That intergenerational connection was so powerful. And after we finished that event, about a few days later, Joan sent me an email and she said, it's been a long time since I've told my story. It's been a long time since I was able to connect to that level. And it felt so good. So I challenge you all, yes, share your story. But if grandma or a next door neighbor, or if you go to a war home or a VA and you see a woman veteran, be willing to say, hey, can I capture your story? And let's look at that collective wisdom and that intergenerational connection where we can learn from each other, right? And be able to say, this was our past, this is our present. What is the what if future that we hope for women who raise their right hand and for other minority populations who raise their right hand? What do we see for our future? So I challenge you all. It doesn't take, just because, yes, I do this for a living, it takes a passionate heart. It takes someone who is inquisitive. It takes someone who is willing to say, learn some more about you. Can we sit? I'll buy some coffee. I'll get us some donuts, whatever you like. Let's do this. You got to record on your iPhone. Just taking some time and connecting.
I appreciate that call to action, that ask of folks. I think that's really important because that's what these dialogues should be about. And we shouldn't just be sitting here looking at each other and just talking. What can we do with this information now that we have it? And so hopefully we're equipping folks that are here. We have a couple questions that came in. One's directed to you, Qwynn, of course, because nobody's here to see me. Qwynn, have you thought of teaming with photographers to document the stories? I did a research grant for photographic documentary on women veterans.
Yeah, I have, and I did one. So the Grace Project, which is an amazing photographer by the name of Sharice Isis, captures the photos of women who are breast cancer survivors. And see, we have somebody that knows her. And in that project, nestled in is what's called the Athena Division. And the Athena Division is specifically for women veterans who have breast cancer. And I had the opportunity to go to the Women's Memorial in October, where Cherise had a panel, and Cherise had her collections on display for Breast Health Awareness Month. To tell these stories, I had the opportunity to unveil Kate's portrait at the event. And really, I've interviewed several women from the Athena Project to allow them the opportunity to tell their story. And just the spirit of, if you have the opportunity to check out the Grace Project and look at these photos, how stellar they are, and just the spirit that emits from looking at these photos of women. So that's the first one that I've done. I am always open to do more, but that one changed my world. It changed my world. And I had the opportunity when Cherise was in Atlanta to sit in while she was photographing. And just seeing these women bear themselves and bear their stories. It's just, when I think about it, I choke up, because it's remarkable work. Another beautiful form of art.
It's amazing. Thank you. Thank you. And we have one more question. Are you connected to any of the vet centers? And I'll make that open-ended in terms of, collecting stories of women veterans, but then also maybe with your doula services, end-of-life doula services.
So I'm writing that down because, quite honestly, I really didn't think about connecting, right? And I'm like, geez, Qwynn, you used to work for the VA. No, I haven't done that. In the last year, no, really the last 6 months, there's been this huge transition between, for me, in being this, like, sitting and getting these stories, more so to educating other people on this ripple effect and having other people be inspired to do this story piece, and collecting the stories. And so I try to at least get a few in a year now, because it can take some time. But we are doing an event in Georgia for the 75th year of women being integrated in the military, and we are doing some interviews. So I'm like, hey, that's a great outreach opportunity, is to connect with the vet centers. So whoever asked that, thank you. I will let our committee know that that's the route. We need to add that as a touch point. Thank you.
I love it. We are all in this learning together. So I love those opportunities. So thank you so much. And thank you for our participants who engaged with us to ask these questions. So we are nearing the end of the hour, and I'm very sad because I feel like this conversation could continue going. Qwynn is now, we haven't been in the same physical room together, but I feel like we're besties for life. So, there'll definitely be more to come with that. But thank you so much for being with us here today, and just enlightening us and empowering us, and connecting with us, and being able to identify the way that these stories matter, and the importance of how we get these stories to others, so we can collectively learn. So thank you for that. And so I also want to give a significant amount of gratitude to our WVEDS committees, specifically Whitney, who is helping with all the technology behind the scenes and getting the links in the chat. So I know, not having to multitask. So thank you so much. And also shout out to Lisa, Lil, Cassie, and Samantha and Alina. Thank you so much for allowing us to get here today, so that way we could hear from Qwynn and the great work that she's doing. And I also want to close out with a poem by one of our WSP alum, Pagie Soltis, where she wrote this beautiful poem and gave me the permission to select a poem that she writes. And this is her way of telling stories, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful way of doing it. And the poem I wanted to share with you all is Emerging. I won't be silenced. No, not again. I'm here to stay. I'm here to win. not for myself, but for the health of society, of humanity. The light is shining so bright, I see victory nearing, only enemy, me. So that wraps up today's session, our WVEDs of telling the stories of women veterans. If this is your first time joining WSP, find a way to stay connected. You can go to our website, warriorscholar.org. And at the bottom of the page, you can sign up to get our emails and newsletters. There's, of course, always staying involved if you yourself are an alum. Alina Suarez is our fellow of outreach and engagement with alumni. And so you can definitely reach out to her to learn more. And then also stay tuned with us. We have future programming coming out. We're going to be introducing a new program called Community Crossroads as a way to connect with resources and a community filled with intersecting identities, recognizing that we all have different intersecting or different identities that intersect with our military connection. And so how can we connect with each other, but then also connect to the resources to identify the unique or experiences that we face because of our intersecting identity. So be on the lookout for more information there. So with that, I think we are, concluding here. Qwynn, do you have anything else that you want to share as we wrap up?
One more thing. So in this space that we're in together, right? Like Linnea said, we're friends now. If you see me on social media, if you want to be friends, if you need someone to say, hey, Qwynn, I'm going to send you a private message, DM, whatever y'all young folks call DMs, or whatever, right? My phone notifies me when they come in. I say all that to say, none of us can do this alone. And I take to heart my call to action in telling our stories. I also take to heart that if you're here in this space and you've served, whatever your gender is, whatever you identify as, if you raised your right hand, we're siblings in arms, and I got you. So it may take me 48 hours, however, we're in this together. And the only way that we can do the amazing work that we continue to do is by doing it together. So with that, you all are my tribe, my people. Let's do these things to ensure that our future is way better than we ever dreamed of when we were in uniform. So thank you. Yes, I love the hearts, all the freaking hearts. Thank you all.